The footlocker sat in the corner of the basement for 3 years. Dust covered its olive-drab surface like a shroud. Theodore Blackwood Jr. had walked past it 1,000 times since his father's funeral in 2015. Each time, he'd told himself tomorrow. Tomorrow he'd go through it. Today was that tomorrow. The lock resisted. Rust had seized the mechanism during 70 years of faithful service. Theodore applied pressure steadily, feeling the metal groan in protest. Then it gave with a sharp crack that echoed in the silent basement. Inside, the smell of old canvas and leather washed over him. Memories in molecular form. Military uniforms folded with parade ground precision. A purple heart nested in a velvet case, the ribbon faded, but the medal still gleaming. Discharge papers dated 1946, the ink brown with age. Photographs of young men who looked like boys grinning at cameras before shipping overseas. But underneath all of it, wrapped in oilcloth that crinkled with brittleness, something else waited. Theodore lifted it carefully. The cloth fell away in pieces. A small wooden box emerged. No markings, no labels, just worn oak that had been handled often over many years, the corners rounded smooth by countless touches. He opened it. 23 letters, yellowed envelopes bound with kitchen twine that had lost its color decades ago, foreign stamps, German postmarks. The name on each one written in careful European script, Anneliese Vogel, and beneath the letters, sitting in a nest of tissue paper that disintegrated at his touch, a tiny compass, red painted metal, the paint chipped and faded, no bigger than a thumbnail, the kind of cheap toy you'd find in a box of candy. Theodore picked it up with reverence he didn't quite understand, turned it over in the weak basement light. On the back, scratched in careful letters that had been deepened by repeated tracing, Papa Blackwood, you showed me true north, a V 1945. The last envelope was different. Thicker paper, American postage, postmarked Cedar Rapids, Iowa, 1968. Theodore opened it with trembling fingers. The handwriting was elegant, European. Careful English script that spoke of concentration and care, each letter formed with deliberate precision. Dear Theodore Jr., you do not know me, but I knew your father. He saved my soul when I had lost my country, my family, and my faith in humanity. I am writing because your father never told you this story. He was too humble. But you should know what kind of man he was. You should know what he gave me when I had nothing left. You should know that his kindness changed not just my life, but the lives of everyone who came after me. This is that story. Theodore sat on the cold basement floor. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight filtering through the window above. His father had been gone 3 years. His mother followed a year later. He thought he knew them, thought he understood their lives. But this letter suggested whole chapters he'd never read. And he began to read. November 12th, 1944. The transport truck rumbled through flat Illinois countryside, its engine a monotonous growl that had become the soundtrack of captivity. Inside, 43 women sat in silence so complete it felt like a physical presence. They wore grey auxiliary uniforms that had once been crisp and proper. Now they were wrinkled and stained, marked by weeks of processing through military channels that moved with bureaucratic indifference. Anneliese Vogel kept her eyes fixed on the truck bed floor. She was 24 years old, though she felt centuries older. Dark blonde hair pulled back in a bun that had somehow survived the chaos of capture, transport, interrogation, and classification. In her pocket, she clutched a photograph like a talisman. Her family. The edges worn soft from constant handling, the faces beginning to fade from her anxious fingers, tracing their features again and again. The propaganda had told her what to expect from American captivity. Brutality first. Americans were soldiers without honor, without discipline. They would beat prisoners for sport. Humiliation next. Democratic weakness meant lack of moral fiber. They would degrade captives to feel superior. Cruelty, always. American capitalism bred selfishness and vice. They would extract everything of value and discard the husk. She had volunteered for the Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1942 with patriotic fervor. Dresden had been her home, a beautiful city of culture and history. Her father worked as an accountant in a respectable firm. Her mother managed their household with the efficient precision expected of German women. Two younger brothers had joined the Wehrmacht with pride, their whereabouts now swallowed by the vast machinery of war. She had believed she served a righteous cause, Germany defending itself against enemies who wanted to destroy German culture, erase German achievements, enslave German people. Now she was a prisoner of those enemies. The truck slowed, made a turn through gates that creaked open. Anneliese allowed herself to look up for the first time in hours. Camp Ellis spread before them under grey November skies. Neat rows of wooden barracks painted regulation colours, well-maintained grounds with paths cleared and marked, American soldiers moving about their duties with casual efficiency rather than aggressive vigilance. Nothing looked menacing, nothing appeared cruel, nothing matched what she'd been trained to expect. Just ordinary military efficiency. The confusion was worse than fear would have been. At least fear was familiar. This cognitive dissonance created vertigo. The truck stopped with a hiss of brakes. An American officer approached, a woman which surprised Anneliese, captain's insignia on her uniform, mid-30s, professional bearing that spoke of competence rather than aggression. Captain Eleanor Whitmore, though Anneliese didn't know the name yet. She spoke in heavily accented German, the words carefully pronounced but grammatically awkward. "You will be housed in barracks 7 and 8. You will receive 3 meals daily. You will be assigned work details appropriate to your skills. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Questions will be answered through your barrack representatives." The words sounded rehearsed, professional, and utterly unlike what Anneliese had been taught to expect. This had to be American deception. The propaganda had warned about this. Lull the prisoners into complacency with false kindness. Lower their guard before the real cruelty began. Psychological warfare, more insidious than physical torture. Inside Barrack 7, metal frame beds stood in military rows. Each had a thin mattress that nonetheless looked clean. 2 blankets, olive drab and wool. A pillow in a white case. At the foot of each bed a small wooden footlocker with a simple latch. Spartan, yes, military certainly, but not the punishment cells she'd been trained to expect, not the overcrowded squalor that propaganda had promised American prisoners would inflict on their German captives. Liesl Hoffmann sat tentatively on one of the beds, the youngest of their group at 19 years old. Her round face still held traces of adolescent softness, despite months of rationed food and weeks of captivity. She bounced slightly, testing the mattress. "It's not what they told us it would be like," Liesl whispered in German, her voice carrying a tremor of confused hope. Anneliese's jaw tightened. Her response came quick and certain, spoken loud enough for the others to hear. "It's exactly what they told us. Americans lie with comfort before they strike with cruelty. Don't be fooled by surface kindness. The true nature will reveal itself soon enough." But even as she spoke the words with conviction, a small seed of doubt had begun to take root somewhere deep in her mind. A tiny voice asking dangerous questions. What if the propaganda was wrong? What if the lies came from a different direction than she'd been taught? She crushed that voice before it could grow. Doubt was weakness. Certainty was strength. She needed strength now. The mess hall bell rang at 1800 hours, sharp, metallic. Several German women flinched at the sound, conditioned by months of military bells signaling everything from meals to air raids. They had been given 30 minutes to settle into their barracks before being summoned for their first meal. 30 minutes to process the cognitive dissonance of clean beds and civil treatment. Annalisa led the group across the compound, maintaining the military bearing that had been drilled into her during training. She refused to show weakness or confusion before her captors. Shoulders back, chin up, eyes forward. Whatever these Americans had planned, she would face it with dignity. The mess hall was a long wooden building with steam escaping from vents along the roofline. The smell of cooking food made her stomach clench with involuntary hunger. Inside, rows of tables and benches filled the space in orderly arrangement. American soldiers occupied roughly half the seats, eating, talking, laughing, relaxed. The sight of men and women dining together so casually struck Annalisa as improper, almost indecent. In Germany, military discipline maintained stricter separation between the sexes. This mixing suggested the looseness of American morals she'd been warned about. But what happened at the serving line shocked her far more than any moral impropriety. An American private stood behind the counter, barely 20 years old, with red hair, freckles, and the look of a farm boy who'd been drafted into service. Nathaniel Weatherby, though she wouldn't learn his name for weeks yet. He began loading her metal tray with food. A large scoop of mashed potatoes, steam rising from the fluffy white mass. Green beans glistening with butter. 2 thick slices of roast beef, the meat still pink in the center. A roll with a pat of butter on the side. Coffee in a ceramic mug, not the thin ersatz brew she'd known in Germany, but rich and dark, and a small square of chocolate cake with white frosting. Annalisa stared at the tray in her hands as if it were a hallucination. This was more food than she had seen in a single meal in over 2 years, more food than her entire family would have received for a week back home. In Germany, rations had been decreasing steadily since 1942. Meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions and military priorities. Butter was a memory most civilians hadn't tasted in years. Chocolate was something children dreamed about but never actually consumed. Real coffee had been replaced by roasted grain substitutes that fooled no one. Yet here she stood, a prisoner of war, an enemy combatant, holding a tray laden with abundance that would feed her entire family back home for days, more food than her dead parents had seen in their final months of life. Margaret Lindemann leaned close as they found seats at an empty table, her sharp eyes taking in every detail with analytical precision. "This can't be real food," she whispered in rapid German. "It must be drugged or poisoned. Why else would they feed prisoners better than their own civilians? It makes no strategic sense. It must be a trap." But the American soldiers were eating the same food from the same kitchen, sitting at tables only a few feet away. Annalisa watched them carefully, noting how they took the abundance for granted. No one treated the meal as special or unusual. Some even left food uneaten on their trays, scraping it into waste bins with casual indifference. The casual waste shocked her more than the quantity. These men were throwing away what would be precious in Germany, what starving people would fight over, what families would carefully divide and ration. Across the table, Greta Lindemann sat with her tray untouched, her communications training making her naturally analytical, 23 years old and already thinking 3 moves ahead. "If this is standard prison food," Greta said quietly, her voice controlled but strained, "what do their civilians eat? What do their soldiers in combat receive?" The propaganda said America was on the brink of economic collapse, that their industry was failing, that they could barely feed their own people. This contradicts everything. The question hung heavy in the air between them, weighted with implications none of them wanted to fully acknowledge. If the propaganda had lied about American poverty and desperation, what else had been a lie? If Americans could feed enemy prisoners this well, what did that say about German claims of inevitable victory? If this was the baseline of American abundance, what did that mean about the entire worldview they'd been taught since childhood? Annalisa picked up her fork. Her hand trembled slightly, whether from hunger or fear she couldn't tell. The first bite of roast beef melted in her mouth. Rich, flavorful, seasoned properly, cooked with care, in a way she had almost forgotten food could taste. Around her, the other German women began to eat. Slowly at first, treating each bite as potentially dangerous. Then with increasing urgency as hunger overcame suspicion and their bodies demanded fuel after weeks of inadequate rations. But with each bite, something shifted. The foundation of everything they believed began to develop tiny cracks, hairline fractures in certainty, questions they'd been trained never to ask starting to form in minds that had been taught to accept official truth without examination. Annalisa forced herself to eat slowly, to maintain control, to not show how desperately hungry she was or how shocking this abundance felt. But inside, in the deepest parts of her mind that she barely acknowledged, the first real doubt took root. What if we were the ones being lied to all along? That first night, Annalisa lay awake in Barrack 7, staring at the rough wooden ceiling crossed with support beams. Around her, 42 other German women slept or pretended to sleep, each processing in their own way what they had experienced during their first hours in American captivity. The meal haunted her thoughts like a ghost that wouldn't be dismissed, not just the abundance of it, though that was shocking enough, but the casual nature of that abundance, the complete lack of special attention or propaganda value. The American guards had shown no pride in displaying their superior resources. They hadn't made speeches about American might or German weakness. They hadn't even seemed to notice that they were feeding enemy prisoners better than most German civilians had eaten in years. They had simply served standard prison rations, as if feeding captured enemies generously was the most normal thing in the world, as unremarkable as breathing. Annalisa had been raised in Dresden in a middle-class family that valued education, culture, and civic duty. Her father had worked as an accountant for a respectable firm, managing numbers with precision and honesty. Her mother had managed their household with the efficient precision expected of German women, making every pfennig count, wasting nothing, creating order from limited resources. She had 2 younger brothers, Hans and Friedrich. Both had joined the Wehrmacht with patriotic enthusiasm in 1941, when war still seemed glorious and victory inevitable. Their whereabouts were now unknown to her, lost in the vast machinery of a military that didn't waste resources tracking individual soldiers when armies measured in millions moved across continents. She had believed in the Reich, not out of fanaticism or blind hatred, out of patriotism, out of faith that her country's leaders knew what was necessary for Germany's survival and prosperity, out of trust that the government told its people the truth about the world and Germany's place in it. When the Women's Auxiliary Corps had called for volunteers in 1942, Annalisa had stepped forward without hesitation. She had been assigned to administrative coordination in occupied France, managing supply records and personnel files with the same precision her father brought to accounting. She had never fired a weapon, never directly participated in combat operations, never seen the front lines of the war, but she had believed she was serving a righteous cause, defending her homeland against enemies who wanted to destroy German culture, erase German achievements, and enslave German people. The propaganda had been consistent and convincing throughout her service. America was portrayed as a failing democracy, torn apart by racial strife and economic collapse. American soldiers were depicted as undisciplined criminals given uniforms. Their military effectiveness was described as a myth perpetuated by Jewish-controlled media. American abundance was presented as a facade, hiding desperate poverty and social disintegration. Yet the evidence of her own eyes contradicted every single claim she'd been taught to believe. The camp was well organized and professionally run with obvious planning and resources. The American soldiers were disciplined and appeared well trained despite their casual demeanor. The food was not just adequate, but generous, suggesting resources far beyond what propaganda had claimed existed in a collapsing American economy. Annalise rolled onto her side, pulling the surprisingly clean blanket closer against the November cold. The heating system worked, maintaining bearable temperature despite the season. Another small detail that contradicted the narrative of American industrial failure. 2 beds away, she could hear Liesl crying softly in the darkness. The girl was homesick, frightened, and too young to have developed the hardened shell that older prisoners cultivated as protection against despair. Tomorrow they would begin work assignments. Tomorrow they would interact more directly with their American captors. Tomorrow would bring more evidence that would either confirm her beliefs or continue to undermine them. Part of Annalise desperately wanted to cling to what she had been taught, to find explanations that preserved her worldview and maintained certainty in an uncertain world. Perhaps this camp was exceptional, designed specifically for propaganda purposes to impress Red Cross inspectors. Perhaps the food abundance was temporary, meant to soften them psychologically before interrogation or exploitation. Perhaps everything would soon reveal itself to be the elaborate deception she had been warned about by instructors who claimed to understand American psychology. But another part of her, a part she tried desperately to suppress, whispered dangerous thoughts in the darkness. Perhaps she had been the one deceived all along. Perhaps the real propaganda had come from her own government, not from the enemy. Perhaps everything she had believed and served had been built on lies from the very foundation. The thought terrified her more than any physical threat the Americans could pose. Fear of pain was manageable. Fear that your entire life had been based on deception was existential horror. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep. But sleep was a long time coming. Morning came cold and grey over Camp Ellis. The bugle played reveille with military precision. A familiar sound in an unfamiliar context. The same notes German buglers played, but in a different accent somehow. The German women dressed quickly in the same auxiliary uniforms they had worn since capture. Their clothing was wrinkled but reasonably clean after weeks of processing. They had been promised access to laundry facilities and possible replacement clothing if needed. After another abundant breakfast that left them uncomfortable with fullness, eggs, bacon, toast, jam, real coffee, Captain Whitmore announced work assignments during morning assembly in the mess hall. The women would be divided into groups based on their previous skills and training. The Americans were pragmatic about using their skills efficiently. Some would work in the camp laundry, using their domestic training, others in the kitchen, putting cooking skills to use. Still others in administrative offices where their education and clerical experience could be valuable. Some would work in the medical facility under American supervision. Annalise found herself assigned to the camp's central administration building, along with Greta and Kathrin Richter, a former teacher from Berlin with sharp eyes and a sharper mind. They would be sorting and filing paperwork under the supervision of an American sergeant. Their education and administrative experience made them valuable for record-keeping. The work itself was mundane and familiar, the kind of bureaucratic labor Annalise had performed throughout her service in occupied France. Forms needed filing, records needed updating, supply requests needed processing. The machinery of military administration ground on regardless of which side operated it. But the working conditions startled her with their unexpected civility. The office was heated with a system that worked reliably, not luxuriously warm, but comfortable enough to work without numb fingers. Coffee was available throughout the day in a large percolator that was kept full. The Americans drank it constantly, treating unlimited coffee as a basic right rather than a precious luxury. The American staff treated them not as enemies to be exploited, but as temporary workers to be trained, giving instructions without hostility, offering corrections without cruelty, expecting competence but allowing for language barriers and cultural differences. Sergeant Theodore Blackwood supervised their section of the administration building. He was 42 years old, with graying hair at the temples and gentle eyes that seemed perpetually patient. From Ohio, though Annalisa didn't know that yet. He would turn out to be the most important person she would ever meet, though she certainly didn't know that either. He spoke no German beyond a few basic words, but he used patient gestures and simple English words to communicate expectations, repeating himself without frustration when they didn't immediately comprehend, demonstrating tasks clearly, checking understanding without condescension. During their mid-morning break, he offered them coffee and cookies from a tin on his desk, not military rations from a supply depot, actual homemade cookies that someone had baked with care, probably his wife, based on the domestic tin they came from, decorated with flowers and marked with a name, Sarah. He shared them as casually as he might share with American colleagues. No ceremony, no expectation of gratitude. Just basic human kindness extended across enemy lines without apparent thought. Annalisa took a cookie with trembling fingers, bit into it carefully as if it might contain hidden poison or secret messages. Homemade oatmeal, still slightly warm from recent baking as if fresh from an oven that morning, sweet with brown sugar, textured with raisins, made with real butter whose richness her tongue recognized immediately after years of margarine substitutes. The simple domesticity of it broke something inside her that military discipline and propaganda training couldn't protect. She excused herself quickly, found the latrine, locked herself in a stall where no one could see, and cried for the first time since her capture, cried for the life she'd lost, for the parents she missed desperately, for the brothers whose fates were unknown, for the country that was losing a war it had promised would be won, for the beliefs that were crumbling under the weight of contradictory evidence, cried for the terrifying possibility that everything she'd based her life on was a lie. After several minutes, she composed herself, washed her face with cold water, returned to the office with her mask of composure firmly in place. Sergeant Blackwood looked up when she returned. His expression held concern but no questions. He simply nodded and returned to his work, allowing her dignity by not acknowledging her obvious distress. That small gesture of respect meant more than she could have explained. The days took on a rhythm that became almost comfortable in its predictability. Morning reveille at 0600 hours. The bugle's call cutting through dawn silence. Abundant breakfast in the mess hall, eggs prepared different ways, meat, bread, real butter, coffee that never ran out, work assignments from 0800 to 1200 hours, filing, sorting, processing the paperwork that kept military bureaucracy functioning, lunch, another full meal with variety that seemed wasteful in its abundance, afternoon work from 1300 to 1700 hours, more filing, more sorting, learning the American systems that were simultaneously familiar and foreign, dinner at 1800 hours, hot food, full portions, desserts that seemed frivolous during wartime, evening in the barracks until lights out at 2200 hours, time to write letters that couldn't be sent, to talk in hushed German about the cognitive dissonance they all felt. Each day brought small kindnesses that accumulated like drops of water slowly wearing away stone. Sergeant Blackwood noticed when Annalisa struggled with English terminology. He would write words down in clear block letters, pronounce them slowly and carefully, wait patiently while she repeated them back with her German accent, mangling the unfamiliar sounds. He never showed frustration when she had to ask multiple times, never made her feel stupid for not understanding immediately, never treated her as less than human despite the uniform she wore and the country she'd served. His patience was relentless and somehow more devastating than cruelty would have been, cruelty she'd been trained to resist. Kindness dissolved her defenses in ways she didn't know how to counter. One afternoon in late November, he pulled out his wallet during their break, opened it to show her photographs, protected in plastic sleeves, their colors slightly faded but still clear. Two young women, both around Annalise's age, one blonde like her, the other with darker hair. He pointed to each photo with obvious pride. Margaret, Elizabeth. His voice carried the warmth fathers have when speaking of daughters. My girls, both in college now, smart like you. The comparison startled her. He was seeing similarity between his daughters and an enemy prisoner. Then he pointed to Annalisa, made a gesture indicating similarity in age, waiting to see if she understood. She did. And in broken English mixed with gestures and the few German words he knew, she showed him the photograph from her pocket. Her family. Creased and worn from constant handling, her parents who she missed desperately, her two younger brothers in their Wehrmacht uniforms. He studied it carefully with respectful attention, then pointed to the brothers, made a gesture like firing a rifle, a question in his eyes that needed no translation. She nodded, throat tight. Wehrmacht. He nodded back slowly. Sadness crossed his face, but no hatred, no anger, just profound sorrow at the waste of young lives on both sides. Then he did something that stunned her into frozen silence. He placed his hand over his heart in a gesture that transcended language, then extended it toward her photograph in a motion that clearly conveyed respect and shared grief. A gesture of shared humanity across enemy lines. Recognition that war created losses on both sides. Acknowledgement that mothers grieved the same in every language. Annalisa felt tears threatening again. She blinked them away rapidly, nodded her thanks because words were impossible in any language. That night, she tried to write a letter home, something she did most evenings despite knowing the letters couldn't be sent while the war continued. Dear Mama and Papa, I am well and being treated in accordance with international law. The Americans provide adequate food and shelter. Please do not worry about my circumstances. I remain hopeful for eventual reunion when this war finally ends. She paused, read the careful, neutral words. They were true but empty, revealing nothing of the transformation happening inside her, nothing of the doubt eating away at certainty, nothing of the terrible possibility that everything she'd believed was wrong. On a separate piece of paper, one she would never submit for military censorship, she began writing what she really wanted to say. Dear Mama, I don't know how to tell you this. I don't know if I even should. But everything we believed about America was wrong. Not slightly wrong or exaggerated for propaganda purposes. Completely, fundamentally, devastatingly wrong. They have abundance beyond anything I can adequately describe. Yesterday, an American soldier complained that his coffee wasn't hot enough, complained about coffee temperature, as if having unlimited coffee is a right rather than a luxury most Germans can't even remember. I've seen them throw away food that would feed a German family for days, not rotten food, not spoiled or unsafe. Perfectly good food that they simply didn't want to finish eating. Their prisoners eat better than our civilians, better than our soldiers on the front lines if the rations I remember from supply records are accurate. I don't know what this means for Germany, for the war, for everything I believed I was fighting for. I don't know who I am anymore. She stopped writing. Her hand trembled so badly the words became illegible scrawls. Even in an unsendable letter, the words felt dangerous, like admitting treason, like betraying everything she'd been raised to believe. She folded the paper carefully, tucked it into the Thomas Mann novel she hadn't received yet, this memory confused with future events in her exhausted mind, and tried to sleep while questions she'd never been taught to ask circled in her thoughts like vultures waiting for certainty to die. December arrived with the first real cold. Winter settling over Illinois with the kind of bitter chill that made people from warmer climates huddle indoors. The barracks had heating that worked reliably. Not luxurious warmth, but adequate comfort. More than adequate by the standards Annalisa had known in Germany's final war years, when fuel was rationed and cold was accepted as part of wartime sacrifice. The work in the administration office continued, the routines continued. The small daily kindnesses from Sergeant Blackwood continued with relentless consistency. And with each passing day, the cognitive dissonance grew harder to ignore or explain away. On December 5, 1944, everything changed in a way that would define the rest of Annalisa's life. It was a Tuesday, cold but clear. The winter sun slanted through the office windows at a low angle that made everything look golden and somehow precious. Annalisa was filing supply requisitions with mechanical efficiency, mindless work that let her thoughts drift to Dresden, to her parents, to the life she'd left behind. Sergeant Blackwood arrived that afternoon carrying a cardboard box under his arm. He set it on his desk with a thump, opened it with casual movements, pulled out smaller individual boxes from inside. Each smaller box was brightly colored with commercial printing, red and yellow, professional design. Images of a sailor boy and his dog prominently featured on the front. He called Greta over with a friendly gesture and his usual patient smile, held out one of the small boxes to her. Greta approached cautiously, took the offered item with uncertain hands, examining it as if it might explode or transform into something dangerous. The box was labeled Crackerjack in bold letters that even someone with limited English could read. Below that, smaller text promised, "The more you eat, the more you want." Sergeant Blackwood pantomimed eating, pointed at the box with encouraging gestures, smiled that patient smile he always wore. "Candy and peanuts," he said slowly in English, speaking clearly for their benefit. "Caramel popcorn, good sweet American favorite." He handed boxes to Annalisa and Katrine as well, then distributed them to other prisoners working in nearby offices, moving through the building with cheerful generosity. Annalisa held hers carefully, examined the packaging with the attention to detail her administrative training had ingrained. The printing was bright and professional. This was a commercial product, not military rations, mass-produced for civilian markets, available to ordinary Americans as casual snacks. She opened the box with slow, deliberate movements. The sweet smell of caramel hit her immediately. Rich, sugary, the scent of abundance and frivolity. Inside, candied popcorn and peanuts coated in a glossy brown glaze that caught the light. She took a small piece between her fingers, examined it, tasted it cautiously as if it might contain hidden messages or poison. The sweetness was almost overwhelming after years of sugar rationing in Germany. Sweet like childhood memories. Sweet like Christmas before the war. Sweet in ways she'd almost forgotten food could be. Then Greta made a small sound of surprise that cut through the quiet office sounds. She had poured her contents into her hand to examine them more carefully and found something unexpected among the candied pieces. A small, wrapped package. Wax paper folded around something solid. Inside the package, a tiny toy, a miniature metal whistle painted bright red. Functional, complete, free. "There's something inside," Greta said in German, her voice filled with confusion that bordered on distress. "There's a toy inside the candy. A metal toy, just given away." Katrine opened her box quickly, found a small wooden puzzle, pieces that fit together to form a picture. Annalisa poured her contents into her palm with hands that had begun to tremble, and there, among the caramel-coated kernels, wrapped in wax paper, sat a tiny compass. Metal, painted red, miniature, no bigger than her thumbnail. She unwrapped it with fingers that shook despite her best efforts at control. The compass was perfectly functional. The needle moved freely on its pivot, pointing north with absolute accuracy despite its toy size. The concept was utterly incomprehensible to her German mind, trained on efficiency and wartime scarcity. Why would anyone put toys inside food? What kind of society had such abundance that they could afford to give away manufactured goods, metal goods during wartime, with candy? What kind of economy could sustain such frivolous, wasteful generosity as standard practice? What kind of industrial capacity allowed this when they were fighting a war on two fronts against Germany and Japan simultaneously? Sergeant Blackwood laughed at their expressions with genuine amusement, clearly pleased by their shock but not understanding its depth. "Prize inside," he explained in simple English, gesturing broadly to illustrate the surprise element. "Every box, different prizes, kids love it. Cracker Jack always has a prize, that's the whole point. Part of what you pay for." Always, as in every single time, as in this was normal, expected, a standard feature of a common snack food. As in American children received manufactured metal toys free with candy, and probably played with them for a few days before losing interest and moving on to the next thing. Annalisa stood frozen in the administration office, holding the Cracker Jack box in one hand, the tiny compass in the other, the needle swinging and settling, always finding north, no matter how she turned it. And something inside her shattered, not loudly, not dramatically, not with thunder or earthquakes, but completely, fundamentally, irreparably. This wasn't military rations distributed to demonstrate American superiority. This wasn't strategic generosity designed to weaken enemy resolve. This was ordinary American childhood, the baseline of civilian life in a country at war. Toys hidden in candy boxes just for fun, just because they could, just because abundance allowed for frivolity even during total war. If this was what American children took for granted as normal and unremarkable, what did that mean about everything she had been told about American poverty? About American desperation, about American weakness, about the inevitable German victory she'd been promised since 1939? In Germany, every gram of metal was precious, rationed strictly, reserved exclusively for war production. Bullets, weapons, machinery. Nothing wasted on civilian frivolity or children's entertainment. Housewives turned in their pots and pans to be melted down for the war effort. Churches gave their bells to be recast as artillery. Every scrap was collected, catalogued and repurposed with German efficiency. Yet America, while fighting a war on two fronts against powerful enemies, still had the industrial capacity to manufacture toys. Throwaway prizes for candy boxes that children would receive, play with for a few days, probably discard or lose or forget about. The implications were staggering, devastating, world-shattering. "Mein Gott," she whispered, the words barely audible. Greta looked at her with dawning understanding in her analytical eyes. The communications specialist's mind was calculating industrial capacity, resource allocation, economic systems, all the data points that didn't add up according to what they'd been taught. "If they can afford to put metal compasses in candy boxes," Greta said slowly in German, speaking each word with careful precision, "during wartime, when every resource should be devoted to military production." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The conclusion was inescapable for anyone willing to see it. Annalisa turned the tiny compass over in her fingers, watched the needle swing in its housing, settle pointing north with perfect accuracy. Her entire worldview had been built on lies, American poverty, a fabrication designed to make Germans feel superior, American weakness, a fantasy to justify underestimating an enemy with vast industrial capacity, American desperation, propaganda to convince Germans that victory was inevitable when it clearly wasn't. If they had lied about this, about something so fundamental as the economic reality of their enemy, what else had been a lie? The righteous cause she thought she served, The inevitable German victory she had been promised, the barbaric enemies she had been trained to fear. Everything. That evening in Barrack 7, the Cracker Jack boxes became the center of intense discussion among the German women. The story had spread through both barracks like wildfire. Everyone wanted to see the evidence with their own eyes, to touch proof that their worldview was crumbling. Annalisa sat on her bunk, turning the tiny compass over in her fingers while conversations swirled around her in urgent German whispers that rose and fell like waves. Liesel had heard about the incident from the women who worked in administration. She had spread the story throughout the camp with the enthusiasm of youth discovering something important. Now everyone wanted to examine the toys, to hold physical evidence of American abundance. The small toys were passed from hand to hand like religious relics, each woman examining them with expressions ranging from wonder to distress to anger to confusion. "It's propaganda," insisted Ingrid Krause, a former factory worker from Munich. She was older than most at 35, with a hard face and harder beliefs, a true believer who needed certainty. "They're trying to convince us of American superiority with cheap tricks, obviously fabricated to weaken our resolve." But Katrine shook her head slowly, her teacher's mind working through the logical implications with methodical precision. "Propaganda would require showing us these things deliberately," she argued, "making a spectacle, drawing attention to American abundance. The sergeant shared them casually, offhandedly, the way you'd share something ordinary and completely unremarkable. He didn't make a speech about American superiority. He didn't call attention to the metal content during wartime. He just handed out candy the way anyone might during a work break. That's what makes it devastating. It's normal to them." Greta held up the tiny whistle she had found in her box, examined it in the weak light of the barracks' overhead bulbs. "These toys are manufactured in factories," she said quietly, her voice carrying the certainty of someone trained in industrial processes. "Thousands of them must be produced daily to put one in every box sold across America. That requires industrial capacity we were told they didn't have. Design effort, resources, quality control, all for something that children receive free with candy and probably throw away after a few days when they get bored." The implications hung in the air like smoke, choking certainty. Germany's entire industrial might had been focused with brutal efficiency on war production for years. Civilian goods had become increasingly scarce as factories converted to military needs. Luxuries had disappeared entirely from stores. Even basic necessities were rationed carefully with cards and stamps and bureaucratic controls. Yet America, while fighting a war on two fronts against powerful enemies on opposite sides of the globe, still had the industrial capacity to manufacture frivolous toys as throwaway prizes in candy boxes, still had resources to waste on children's entertainment, still had the economic strength to treat abundance as normal rather than exceptional. Annalisa found her voice, though speaking the words felt like betrayal of everything she'd been raised to believe. "My brothers used to talk about the shortages before I was captured and sent to France," she said slowly, remembering conversations from what felt like another lifetime. Rubber, metal, fuel, everything was desperately needed for the war effort. We were told that America was suffering even worse shortages, that their economy was collapsing under the strain of war production, that they could barely arm their soldiers and would certainly collapse before Germany did. She held up the tiny compass for everyone to see. The needles swung and settled, pointing north with perfect accuracy. But they're putting metal compasses in candy boxes, not to boost morale or support the war effort or serve any strategic purpose, just because that's what they do normally. Even during wartime, even while fighting us and Japan simultaneously, they have so much industrial capacity that they can waste it on toys for children. The silence that followed her observation was heavy with implications none of them wanted to fully acknowledge. If America had such abundance that they could waste resources on toys in candy boxes during wartime, what did that say about German propaganda claims of American weakness? What did it say about the inevitable German victory they had all been promised since the war began? What did it say about the competence and honesty of their own leaders? What did it say about everything they had believed and served and sacrificed for? Annalisa lay in her bunk that night long after lights out, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet sounds of 42 other women processing their own doubts. She held the compass on her chest, felt it rising and falling with her breathing, watched the needle glow faintly in the darkness, painted with luminescent material so it could be read at night. Even a toy compass had features that served no purpose but to delight children. In her mind, she saw the compass needle swinging, searching, then settling on true north. She had believed the Reich pointed toward truth, toward righteousness, toward destiny, toward the future, but the needle had been broken all along, spinning wildly, pointing in wrong directions, leading her into darkness while calling it light. This tiny American compass pointed a different direction, toward a truth she wasn't ready to face, toward a future she couldn't yet imagine, toward the terrifying possibility that everything she had believed, everything she had served, everything she had been, was built on lies from the very foundation. She closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. She opened them again, picked up the compass, watched the needle swing and settle with mechanical precision, and whispered into the darkness of Barrack 7, her voice barely audible, even to herself. "Show me the way forward, because I'm lost." The compass didn't answer, but it kept pointing north, steady, certain, true, even when she didn't know what truth meant anymore. December settled over Camp Ellis with the kind of cold that penetrated to the bone, the kind that made breath visible and fingers numb despite gloves, the kind that reminded everyone winter was a force to be reckoned with. Annalisa Vogel woke each morning to frost patterns on the barrack windows, intricate crystalline designs that nature created with careless artistry, beautiful, delicate, like the propaganda posters back home that promised German precision and discipline would triumph over American chaos and weakness. But the chaos she had been warned about never materialized in any form she recognized. Instead, there was routine, structure, organization, and an abundance that grew more unsettling with each passing day because it contradicted everything she'd been taught to believe about America's declining power. The crackerjack compass sat on her footlocker like a tiny accusation. She looked at it every morning when she woke, every night before sleeping, a red reminder that everything she thought she knew had been carefully constructed deception. The work in the administration office continued with the rhythm of bureaucracy that transcended national boundaries. Filing, sorting, processing, the mundane machinery of military organization in any language. But something fundamental had shifted after the compass revelation. The crack in her certainty had widened into a chasm. Annalisa found herself watching the Americans differently now. Not with the wary suspicion of a prisoner studying her captors for signs of hidden cruelty, but with genuine curiosity about who these people actually were beneath the propaganda caricatures. Sergeant Theodore Blackwood arrived each morning at 07:30 with clockwork punctuality, German precision in an American uniform. He carried a thermos of coffee that he always offered to share, always with that same patient expression that seemed incapable of impatience or anger. He never asked questions about military intelligence or tried to extract information about German operations, never treated her as an asset to be exploited or a source to be developed, never seemed to see her as anything other than a person doing work that needed doing. He just worked alongside them with quiet competence. One morning in early December, he brought photographs again, Not just his daughters this time like before, his whole family arranged in what was clearly a formal portrait. He spread them on his desk carefully, pointed to each person with obvious affection, spoke slowly in English, enunciating clearly for their benefit. My wife, Sarah, good woman, patient with me. He smiled at some private memory. Mum, my daughters, Margaret, Elizabeth, both smart, both in college now. Make me proud. Then he pointed to a young man in uniform, a different photo, separate from the family portrait. His expression changed dramatically. The smile faded. Sadness replaced the usual warmth in his eyes. My nephew, Thomas. Good boy. Brave. He paused, searching for simple words they would understand. Normandy. June. Gone. The word hung in the air between them with the weight of permanent loss. Normandy, where German forces had fought desperately to hold the beaches against overwhelming Allied assault, where thousands died on both sides in a single day, where the outcome of the war began to shift toward inevitable Allied victory. Annalisa understood immediately. This man, this kind, patient man who shared his coffee and cookies without apparent thought, had lost someone to her side, to the Wehrmacht, to German defenders, perhaps even to artillery or supplies that her own administrative work had helped move through the system. She expected hatred after this revelation, resentment, cold, withdrawal, the natural human response to facing someone connected to your loss. Instead, Blackwood looked at her photograph, the one of her family she still carried like a talisman. He pointed to her brothers in their Wehrmacht uniforms with gentle recognition, and he nodded slowly. A simple nod that acknowledged the terrible symmetry of war. Young men killing each other while families on both sides grieved equally, mothers crying in German and English for sons who would never return, fathers growing old without the children who should have carried on their names. Annalisa felt something crack inside her chest, different from the crackerjack moment. That had shattered her beliefs about American society and economic strength. This shattered her beliefs about American character and moral capacity. She had been taught that Americans were soft, sentimental, weak, unable to make hard sacrifices or endure real suffering. That their democracy made them divided and incapable of the discipline necessary for total war. That their emphasis on individual rights made them unable to function as a coherent military force. But this man had lost his nephew to German bullets, had buried that grief somewhere deep inside, had been assigned to supervise German prisoners, perhaps as some cosmic irony or deliberate test of his character, and he still chose to treat his enemies with patience and dignity and basic human respect. That wasn't weakness, that was strength she didn't know how to categorize within the framework she'd been given. "I'm sorry," she said in halting English, the words coming slowly as she searched for pronunciation, her first real attempt at the language beyond work-related necessities. "For your... Thomas, I am... sorry." Blackwood's eyes widened slightly in surprise that she had spoken English, that she had acknowledged his loss, that she had offered something approaching human sympathy across enemy lines. Then he placed his hand over his heart in that gesture he had made before. But this time he spoke words she would remember for the rest of her life. Words that would define everything that came after. War takes from everyone, from all sides, but we choose what we give to the living. He paused, making sure she was following his simple English. Your brothers fight for Germany. My nephew fought for America. Both thought they fought for right. Both brave. Both lost to war's hunger. Another pause. But you and I, we choose now. Give hate or give chance for different. She didn't fully understand every English word, but she understood the meaning with perfect clarity. He was offering her something impossible. Grace, forgiveness, the possibility that human connections could transcend national hatreds and military conflicts. And she understood that she was receiving something she didn't deserve but desperately needed. A path forward through the wreckage of everything she'd believed. The second week of December brought the first rumors that spread through the barracks like ripples across water. The International Red Cross was distributing packages to prisoners of war, all prisoners, in accordance with the Geneva Convention that protected captives from both sides. Annalisa didn't believe it at first when Liesl brought the news, couldn't process the concept. Packages from whom? For what purpose? Containing what? But on December 23, 1944, Captain Eleanor Whitmore made an announcement during the midday assembly that changed everything again. The Red Cross packages had arrived, donated by American civilians specifically for German prisoners held in American camps. The words made no logical sense when strung together that way. American civilians, spending their own money, donating goods and comfort items for enemy prisoners, for German soldiers and auxiliaries who served the regime, fighting to kill American boys overseas, while their own sons and brothers and fathers fought German forces in France and Belgium and prepared for the push into Germany itself. The contradiction was too sharp to process without pain. Captain Whitmore's voice carried across the assembled prisoners with surprising gentleness. These packages were donated by American families, churches, and charitable organizations. They wanted you to know that you are not forgotten, that even in war, humanity remains important, that you are prisoners, yes, but you are still people, deserving of basic dignity and comfort. Annalisa felt her worldview cracking further. Americans weren't supposed to think this way. They were supposed to be barbaric, cruel, motivated only by self-interest and capitalist greed. Yet here was evidence of charity extended to enemies. The packages arrived in the mess hall that afternoon, stacked on tables near the serving line in neat rows. Each box bore Red Cross markings and identifying numbers. Each had a name written in careful English script by American hands. Captain Whitmore called the women forward one by one, treating the distribution with ceremony that elevated it beyond simple logistics. Annalisa approached when her name was called, her heart pounding with confused anticipation. Her hands trembled as she accepted the cardboard box with her name written on it. Annalisa Vogel. Written by an American stranger who had chosen to give rather than hate, who had spent time and money on someone they would never meet, someone whose country was trying to kill their loved one. She carried it back to her seat as if it were something sacred, something too precious to jostle or drop. Around her, the other women were opening their packages with reverence and disbelief, gasps of surprise, some tears, whispered German conversations that rose in volume as the contents were revealed. Annalisa opened hers with slow, deliberate movements, savoring the anticipation, afraid of what it might mean. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that rustled with gentle care, was a blue knitted scarf. She lifted it out with trembling hands. The wool was soft, high quality, hand-knitted with obvious skill and attention. Someone had spent hours making this, creating each stitch with care and precision, choosing a color, imagining the recipient who would wear it, for an enemy, for a stranger, for her. Beneath the scarf, more treasures emerged like gifts from a fairy tale, a bar of lavender soap wrapped in paper. The scent brought instant tears to her eyes because it smelled exactly like her mother's bathroom in Dresden before the war. Before everything changed, before the world caught fire. A small bag of hard candies, peppermint, real sugar, not the ersatz sweeteners that fooled no one in Germany. A deck of playing cards with an American flag design on the back. The cards felt new, unused, crisp, and at the bottom, wrapped in brown paper and string, a book. Annalisa pulled it out, her breath caught in her throat, hard enough to hurt. The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann, a German author, writing in German, but published in America because it had been banned in Germany since 1933. Declared degenerate art by the Reich she had served, removed from libraries, burned in public squares while students cheered. Yet here it was, in a package from American civilians, given freely to a German prisoner who had been told for years that Americans wanted to destroy German culture. They were giving her German culture that her own government had tried to erase. The irony was almost too much to bear. The contradiction too sharp to reconcile with propaganda. In Germany, the government decided what citizens could read, what they could think, what truth they could access. Censorship was presented as protection from dangerous ideas. In America, even enemy prisoners had access to forbidden literature, to ideas the Reich had banned, to culture the Nazis had declared degenerate. But it was the handwritten note that finally broke her completely. Tucked inside the book's front cover, careful script on cream-colored paper, written by a hand that had practiced penmanship with care. Dear German friend, we pray for your safe return home when this terrible war ends. We pray for peace between our nations so that such horror never happens again. We pray that you know God's love even in captivity, even far from home, even when the future seems dark. May this Christmas bring you comfort and hope, even in these circumstances. May you remember that you are not forgotten, not hated, but seen as a fellow human being deserving of dignity. May you find your way home when this is over. With Christian love and prayers, the Riverside Lutheran Church Ladies Auxiliary, Davenport, Iowa. Annalisa read it 3 times with tears streaming down her face, then 4 times, then 5 times, until the words blurred and she had to stop or risk staining the paper with her grief and confusion and desperate gratitude. Around her, similar scenes played out like echoes of her own emotion. Greta clutched a pair of hand-knitted mittens with wonder in her analytical eyes. Katrin held a small leather-bound journal, turning it over as if it might vanish. Frida had received sewing supplies and fabric in her package. Even young Liesel, who rarely smiled anymore, held a stuffed bear with wonder brightening her face. These were not strategic gifts from military leadership trying to demoralize through kindness. These were personal gestures from ordinary American civilians who had chosen compassion over hatred, who had chosen to see shared humanity across enemy lines, who had believed that even in war, basic kindness mattered. That night in Barrack 7, the women sat surrounded by their Red Cross packages like children on Christmas morning, trying to reconcile this generosity with everything they had been taught about American character and values. Ingrid Kraus still resisted, her need for certainty making acceptance difficult. "They pity us," she said, her voice defensive and hard. "They're trying to prove their moral superiority, to make us feel inferior and dependent. It's psychological warfare, nothing more." But even as she spoke the words, her hands clutched the knitted scarf she had received. Her fingers traced the careful stitches that someone had labored over for hours. Stitches made with care for someone they would never meet. The disconnect between her words and her actions was visible to everyone. Annalisa held the Thomas Mann novel like something precious beyond measure, ran her fingers over the cover, felt the weight of it in her hands. The symbolism was not lost on her or anyone else with education enough to understand. In America, even enemy prisoners had access to literature that the Reich had banned for its own citizens. What did that say about which system feared the truth? Which system trusted its people with ideas? Which system was truly strong enough to allow dissent and difference? "They're not proving superiority," Katrin said quietly, her teacher's mind working through the implications. "They're demonstrating what they believe, that all people have value, that even enemies deserve basic dignity, that hate isn't the only possible response to conflict." She held up her journal, examining it in the weak light. This terrifies our leaders more than any military defeat, because it shows that the enemy we were taught to fear actually lives by principles our government only pretends to value. The words hung in the cold air of Barrack 7 like a truth too dangerous to speak, but impossible to deny. Christmas Day came to Camp Ellis with fresh snow and clear skies. Captain Whitmore had arranged for small decorated trees in each barrack, brought in from local farms. The mess hall served a special meal that would have been luxurious in peacetime and felt almost obscene during war. Roasted turkey with stuffing, cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes, gravy, fresh bread, butter, vegetables, and pumpkin pie for dessert with real whipped cream. More abundance, more generosity, more evidence that everything they'd been taught was lies. The American guards who worked the holiday shift seemed cheerful rather than resentful about missing Christmas with their own families. Several had brought small gifts for the prisoners they supervised regularly, personal gestures that went beyond duty or orders. Sergeant Blackwood arrived at the administration building despite it being a holiday. He carried a box of chocolates wrapped in red paper with a bow, distributed them to his German workers with the same patient smile he always wore. "Merry Christmas," he said simply, as if giving chocolates to enemy prisoners on the day celebrating Christ's birth was the most natural thing in the world. Annalisa accepted a chocolate piece with trembling fingers, found her voice in English that was improving daily through necessity and practice. "Thank you. Merry Christmas, Sergeant Blackwood." His smile widened with obvious pleasure at her improving English and willingness to engage. Then he did something unexpected that would stay with her forever. He sat down at his desk, pulled out a photograph newer than the family pictures he had shown before. More recent, more painful. It showed his family around a Christmas tree in what was clearly their home. His wife Sarah, his daughters Margaret and Elizabeth, all smiling with the innocent happiness of people who believed their world was secure, who believed their loved ones would return safely. "This is from last Christmas," he said slowly and clearly, making sure she understood each word. "Before I was deployed to Camp Ellis, before I knew I would spend this Christmas here instead of home with them." He looked at the photograph for a long moment. Homesickness and longing written clearly on his weathered face. The cost of service visible in his eyes. Then he looked at Annalisa with an expression that held both sadness and kindness in equal measure. "You miss your family too," he said. Not a question, a statement of shared truth that transcended nationality and military allegiance. Christmas is hard when you're far from home, when you don't know if you'll see them again, when you wonder if they're safe. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Tears threatened, but she blinked them away with effort. He reached into his desk drawer, pulled out several pieces of paper and a pencil, slid them across the desk to her with gentle deliberateness. "Write to them," he said firmly. "I know you can't send letters during the war, but write anyway. Tell them what's in your heart. I'll hold the letters safe until the war ends. Then you can send them or keep them, your choice. But write. It helps to put words down. Trust me on this." The kindness was almost unbearable in its simple humanity. This man who had lost his nephew at Normandy to German bullets, who was spending Christmas away from his family to supervise German prisoners, who had every reason to hate her and everyone like her, was encouraging her to write to her family, was offering her connection and hope and basic human dignity despite everything. Annalisa took the paper with hands that shook visibly. "Thank you," she whispered in English, then repeated it in German because the English felt insufficient. "Danke, thank you, I don't..." She struggled for words in either language. "I know," Blackwood said gently. "You don't have to explain, just write. Tell them what you need to say." That evening she sat on her bunk in Barrack 7 while others celebrated with whatever small joys they could create. The paper lay before her, the pencil in her hand, and she tried to find words for everything that was happening inside her. Dear Mama and Papa, it is Christmas and I am alive and safe and so far from home that it feels like another world entirely. The Americans treat us with unexpected kindness that contradicts everything we were taught. I received a package from civilians in Iowa. People I will never meet. They pray for my safe return. They pray for peace. They gave me a scarf they knitted and books that were banned at home. I am reading Thomas Mann again. Do you remember, Papa, how you used to read to us before they banned the books, before they decided which German culture was acceptable and which was degenerate? I wish you could see this place. I wish I could explain what I'm learning without sounding like I've betrayed everything you raised me to believe. I wish... She stopped writing, stared at the words blurring on the page, realized with horror what she hadn't yet allowed herself to think consciously. She was writing in present tense about her parents as if they were alive and waiting for letters. But she had no idea if that was true. Dresden was a major city, industrial center, strategic target for Allied bombers. The air raids had been intensifying throughout 1944. She'd heard rumors even in captivity about the scale of destruction. Her parents could already be dead, buried in rubble or burned in firestorms. Her brothers could already be dead, rotting in mud somewhere on the Eastern Front or Western Front or in some mass grave with thousands of others. She could be writing letters to ghosts, pouring her heart out to people who couldn't read them because they no longer existed. The thought paralyzed her completely. She set down the pencil with hands that couldn't stop shaking, folded the letter carefully with movements that felt mechanical and distant, tucked it into the Thomas Mann book for safekeeping, and lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling, listening to Liesel cry quietly 2 beds away, hearing Greta's restless movements, sensing the collective grief and confusion of 43 women who were all lost in different ways. War took from everyone, Blackwood had said. But what if it had already taken everything? What if there was nothing left to return to, even if she survived? What then? January 1945 arrived with brutal cold and devastating news that shattered whatever fragile hope remained. The first letters from Germany came through military channels after weeks of processing, carefully screened by both German and American censors before being delivered to the prisoners at Camp Ellis. Each letter had been read multiple times by strangers who redacted anything deemed sensitive or dangerous. Not every woman received mail. The chaos of war and collapsed infrastructure meant many letters never made it through the system. Many more were lost to bombing or bureaucratic incompetence or simple chance. Those letters that did arrive carried news that destroyed the recipients completely. Captain Whitmore distributed them during morning assembly. Her face carried a gravity that warned of pain before any envelopes changed hands. She understood through the censorship process what many of these letters contained. She had read the summaries, knew what was coming. Annaliese's letter came from a neighbor in Dresden, not from her parents, which immediately told her everything she needed to know even before opening it. Her hands shook as she broke the seal, already understanding what that meant, already bracing for confirmation of what she'd feared since Christmas. The neighbor wrote in careful, formal German that tried to soften unbearable news. The Allied bombing raid of October 7th, 1944, had devastated Dresden's old city in a firestorm that consumed everything. Annaliese's apartment building had taken a direct hit in the first wave. The entire structure collapsed within minutes. Her mother died instantly, crushed beneath tons of rubble. A mercy, the letter said, compared to other deaths that night. Her father survived the initial collapse but was pulled from the wreckage badly burned and broken. He lingered for 3 days in a makeshift hospital before succumbing to his injuries. He had asked for his children in his final moments, but none were there. Her brother's whereabouts remained unknown. The Wehrmacht had no records to share with civilians. Soldiers were numbers in a system too vast to track individuals. Missing could mean anything from deployed to captured to dead and buried without identification. Annalisa read the letter 3 times, 4 times, 5 times until the words lost meaning and became just shapes on paper that hurt to look at. The words didn't change no matter how many times she read them. Her parents were dead. Both of them. Gone. The family she had been writing unsendable letters to no longer existed in this world. The home she had dreamed of returning to was rubble and ash and memory. She sat on her bunk in Barrack 7. The letter gripped in hands that had gone numb, feeling nothing because the pain was too large to hold. Numbness was a mercy when grief exceeded human capacity. Around her, similar scenes played out with variations on the same theme of loss. Of the 43 German women at Camp Ellis, 28 had received letters. 17 of those letters contained death notifications. The toll of Allied bombing and Soviet advance was documented in careful, censored language that couldn't hide the scale of devastation. Greta Lindemann learned that her entire neighborhood in Berlin had been destroyed in a firebombing raid, all former neighbors dead or missing, her childhood erased from existence. Frieda Zimmermann discovered that her fiancé had been killed on the Eastern Front 6 months earlier. She had been writing love letters to a dead man all that time, pouring her heart into words that would never be read. Young Liesl Hoffmann's letter brought heartbreak that made her collapse completely. Her father killed when the factory where he worked took a direct hit. Her mother and younger sister evacuated to unknown locations in the chaos. The letter from a former neighbor contained no information about how to contact them or even if they had survived. The grief that filled Barrack 7 that night was profound and complicated beyond words. These women were mourning losses caused by the very forces that now held them captive. American bombs had killed Annalisa's parents. American bombers had destroyed Greta's neighborhood. Allied advance had created the chaos that separated Liesl from her remaining family. Yet those same enemies had shown them more kindness and humanity than their own government ever had. The Americans who had destroyed their homes were also the Americans who shared coffee and Christmas packages and treated them with dignity and basic respect. How did you reconcile that impossible contradiction? How did you hate and thank the same people? How did you process grief when the sources of loss and comfort were identical? The next morning, Captain Whitmore arrived at Barrack 7 shortly after Reveille. Her face showed genuine compassion that transcended duty or military protocol. She had been informed of the letter's contents through the censorship process. She had seen the summaries, read the redacted versions, understood the scale of grief now filling the barracks. She had come to offer what comfort she could, though comfort seemed impossible. Through the camp translator, she expressed condolences that sounded sincere despite the awkwardness of translation, offered access to the camp chaplain for anyone who wished to speak with him, made it clear that grief was acceptable, that crying was allowed, that no one would be punished for showing human emotion. She didn't have to do this. She could have maintained professional distance, let them process their losses privately without acknowledging the pain. But she chose to show up, to recognize their humanity, to offer support even though they were enemies, even though her own forces had caused some of these losses. Annalisa found herself in the camp chapel that afternoon, drawn there by a need she couldn't articulate. Father Patrick O'Brien was an older man with white hair and kind wrinkles around his eyes, Irish Catholic from Boston. He spoke limited German with a heavy accent that mangled pronunciation, but his presence communicated more than words ever could. She sat in a pew near the front, stared at the simple wooden cross on the wall, Christian symbol that transcended nationality and war, reminder of suffering that was supposed to have meaning. And she cried, not quietly, not with restraint, not with any attempt at maintaining dignity or composure. She cried the way a person cries when everything breaks at once and there's nothing left to hold together, for her parents. Dead in the rubble of Dresden while she was safe and fed in an American prison camp, while she had been filing paperwork and eating abundant meals and receiving Christmas packages from Iowa church ladies for her brothers, whereabouts unknown, probably dead in mud somewhere on some front. That didn't matter. Lost to a war that was clearly being lost, despite all the promises of victory for her country. Losing the war one bombing raid at a time, collapsing under the weight of its own lies and overreach and fundamental evil, for her beliefs, shattered beyond any hope of repair by a tiny compass in a candy box and kindness from enemies and the revelation that everything she'd been taught was propaganda, for herself. Lost between two worlds with no home in either, no family to return to, no country she could believe in, no certainty about who she was or what she believed or what her life meant. Father O'Brien sat beside her after several minutes. Didn't speak immediately, just sat in companionable silence. His presence was enough. After a long time, she didn't know how long, time had lost meaning, he said something in heavily accented German. Gott weint mit Ihnen. God weeps with you. Simple words, probably grammatically incorrect, but they reached something in her that had been frozen since reading the letter. Warum? She asked through tears. Why? Why does God allow this? Any of this? All of this? Father O'Brien was quiet for a long moment. She appreciated that he didn't rush to answer with easy platitudes. Ich weiß es nicht, he said, finally in careful German. I don't know. But I know he doesn't abandon us in it. He walks through the fire with us, carries what we cannot carry. It wasn't an answer, not really. It didn't explain or justify or make sense of senseless loss. But it was honest, and honesty felt more valuable than easy comfort or theological explanations that tried to make tragedy meaningful. She sat with him for another hour, sometimes crying, sometimes silent, sometimes speaking in broken German about her parents and her fear and her grief. He listened without judgment, offered tissues, prayed with her in Latin that she didn't understand but found comforting anyway. When she finally left the chapel, the grief hadn't lessened, but it felt slightly less crushing, slightly more bearable. Shared grief, she realized, weighed less than grief carried alone. The days after the letters were the darkest period of Annaliese's captivity. The physical conditions hadn't changed. The Americans continued their professional courtesy and unexpected kindness with the same consistency as before. But internally, she was grappling with grief that had no resolution and guilt that had no expiation. She stopped eating properly without conscious decision. Would sit in the mess hall with food in front of her, still abundant, still more than most German civilians saw, and think about her mother. Her mother who had rationed every meal for years, who had gone hungry so her children could eat, who had made do with less and less while maintaining dignity and order, who had died terrified and in pain beneath burning rubble. How could Annalise accept abundance while her mother's last moments had been terror and agony? How could she enjoy safety and comfort while her parents were dead and her brothers were missing? How could she keep living when so many had died? Sergeant Blackwood noticed the change in her, of course he did. He noticed everything with that patient attention that missed nothing. He appeared one afternoon in the administration office with a cup of tea, set it on her desk without a word of explanation, then went back to his own work as if he hadn't just performed a small act of kindness. No questions, no demands, no forcing her to talk about what was wrong when it was obvious what was wrong. Just tea, warm, sweet, present. The small gesture broke through her numbness like sunlight through clouds. That evening, as she prepared to leave the office at the end of her shift, Blackwood stopped her with a gentle clearing of his throat. "Miss Vogel," he said carefully, using her name for the first time, showing respect through formality. "I heard about your parents through official channels. I'm very sorry for your loss. Truly and deeply sorry." The words were simple, but his eyes held genuine sorrow that couldn't be faked. "Thank you," she managed in English that came easier now after weeks of practice. He hesitated, then continued. "After my nephew died at Normandy, I stopped eating too. Felt wrong to take comfort when he was gone, when he would never eat again or laugh again or have a future. My wife told me something that maybe helps you, maybe not, but I share it anyway." Annalisa waited, sensing something important was coming. She said the dead don't want us to die with them. They want us to live for them, to carry their love forward into the future they won't see, to be worthy of the sacrifices they made, to honor them by continuing despite the pain. Tears streamed down Annalisa's face unchecked. "But how?" she asked, her voice breaking. "How do I do that when everything is gone?" Blackwood's expression was infinitely patient, infinitely kind, infinitely sad, in a way that showed he truly understood loss. "Small steps," he said gently. "One choice at a time. Choose to eat today. Choose to work tomorrow. Choose to keep breathing the day after. Eventually, the choices get easier. The weight gets lighter. Not gone, never gone, but lighter enough to carry." He didn't promise it would be easy. He didn't offer false comfort about time healing all wounds. He didn't minimize her pain or suggest she should move on quickly. He just gave her a path forward when forward seemed impossible. Small steps, one choice at a time. That night, Annalisa ate her full dinner for the first time in days. Forced herself to finish despite the guilt that made every bite feel like betrayal. It felt like betraying her dead parents. It felt like survival when survival seemed wrong. Both were true, and somehow she had to live with both truths simultaneously. February 16th, 1945 was a Thursday that would be burned into memory forever. The morning started like any other. Reveille at 0600. Breakfast, work assignments distributed, normal routine that provided comfort through predictability. But Captain Whitmore's expression during morning assembly was different, grave, troubled, heavy with something she clearly didn't want to share, but felt compelled to anyway. She announced that there would be a special assembly at 1400 hours. Attendance was mandatory, all work details suspended for the afternoon. The tone sent ripples of anxiety through Barrack 7 that intensified throughout the morning. Special assemblies meant news, and news in wartime was rarely good. At 1400 hours precisely, the 43 German women gathered in the mess hall with growing dread. Captain Whitmore stood at the front. Behind her, a projection screen had been set up with military efficiency. Beside her stood a photographer with a military camera. The camp translator waited nearby. The setup suggested something official, something documented, something important and terrible. Whitmore's first words carried weight that pressed down on the room like physical force. "What you are about to see are documentary photographs, evidence, taken by American and British military photographers as Allied forces liberate concentration camps throughout Germany and Poland." Concentration camps. Annalisa had heard rumors, whispers, stories dismissed as enemy propaganda designed to demoralize German civilians and soldiers. Work camps for criminals and political prisoners, she'd been told, nothing more. Labor camps that were harsh but necessary for security. She had believed it because believing otherwise was impossible. The first photograph appeared on the screen. Iron gates. The words Arbeit macht frei welded into the metal. Work makes you free. a slogan that promised liberation through labor. The second photograph replaced it without ceremony, bodies, human bodies, emaciated beyond anything she had ever imagined possible, skeletal, reduced to skin, stretched over bone, piled like cordwood, stacked like objects rather than people. Hundreds of them, thousands of them. Annaliese's mind refused to process what her eyes were seeing. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be Germany. This couldn't be what her government had done. The third photograph. Survivors, if that word even applied. Walking skeletons with eyes that had witnessed hell and somehow survived it. Striped uniforms hanging from frames that barely supported life. Numbers tattooed on arms, humanity reduced to inventory. The fourth photograph, gas chambers, industrial, efficient, designed specifically for mass death with German engineering precision. The fifth photograph, crematoria, ovens for burning bodies by the hundreds, by the thousands, by the tens of thousands, industrial murder at a scale that defied comprehension. The sixth photograph, mountains of personal belongings sorted with German efficiency. Shoes, thousands upon thousands of shoes, each pair worn by a person with a name, a family, a life, dreams, hope, glasses, piles of glasses that people needed to see the world before their world ended in gas and fire. Suitcases, carefully labeled with names and addresses of people who believed they were being relocated when they were actually being murdered. Human hair, tons of it, shaved from corpses and sorted by color for industrial use. The photographs kept coming, camp after camp after camp. Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, Dachau, Buchenwald, Treblinka, Sobibor, names that would echo through history as monuments to human evil. The scale was incomprehensible even as it was documented with photographic precision. This wasn't isolated incidents or wartime necessity or exaggerated propaganda. This was systematic, industrial, intentional, planned with German precision and executed with German efficiency. This was evil, pure, calculated, German evil perpetrated by her government in her name while she filed papers and believed she served a righteous cause. Anneliese heard someone vomiting, realized distantly it was Liesel, heard someone sobbing, realized it was Katrin, felt her own legs giving out, felt someone catch her before she hit the floor. Sergeant Blackwood's steady hands. Ich kann nicht, das ist nicht viel. Wir haben nicht, she stammered in German. I can't, this isn't, we didn't, but the photographs didn't lie. Photography couldn't fabricate this scale of horror, this many camps, this many bodies, this much documentation. It was real, all of it, and she had served the government that built it. Captain Whitmore's voice continued with relentless necessity. These camps existed throughout Germany and occupied territories for years. Millions of people were systematically murdered. Jews, Roma, political prisoners, homosexuals, disabled individuals, anyone deemed undesirable by the Reich you served. Millions. The number was too large to comprehend, too impossible to hold in human mind. These are not fabrications or propaganda. We have testimony from survivors, from liberating soldiers, from neutral Red Cross observers, from German guards who operated these camps. We have documentary evidence that will be presented at war crimes trials after the war ends. She paused. Let the weight settle like ash. I show you this not to punish you personally, not to assign individual guilt for crimes you may not have known about, but because you deserve truth. You served a government that built these death factories. You believed in a system that perpetrated genocide. You need to know what you were part of, whether you knew it or not, whether you participated directly or not. This is the truth of what the Reich really was beneath the propaganda and promises. The room spun. Anneliese stared at the screen showing mountains of shoes. Each pair had been worn by a person, a human being with a name, a family, a child who called them mother or father. Dreams for a future that never came. And the Reich, her Reich, the government she had sworn to serve, had murdered them with industrial efficiency, systematically, intentionally, with German precision turned toward extermination. She had filed papers for this government, managed supply records, coordinated personnel, believed she defended civilization, but her government had built factories of death. Her country had systematized murder on a scale that defied human comprehension. Her people, her educated, cultured, civilized people, had done this. The meeting ended, but Annalisa couldn't move. The women filed out in silence. No one spoke because what words existed for this? She sat frozen, staring at the blank screen, seeing the photographs in her mind on endless repeat. Sergeant Blackwood crouched beside her chair, put a hand on her shoulder. "Come on, Miss Vogel, let's get you back to the barracks. You need to sit down properly, process this with the others." She let him guide her out like a child. Her legs moved without conscious thought, back to Barrack 7, where 42 other women were processing the same impossible horror. She sat on her bunk, stared at nothing. Everything she had believed, everything she had served, everything she had been, built on a foundation of monstrous evil that defied comprehension. She had filed papers, transmitted orders, managed supply chains for a military system. Had her work enabled this? Had the documents she processed sent people to these death camps? Had her efficient administration helped the machinery of genocide function smoothly? She couldn't know, would never know. And that uncertainty was its own kind of hell that would follow her forever. That night, no one in Barrack 7 slept. The women sat in small groups, speaking in hushed German that rose and fell like waves, trying to process the impossible with inadequate language. "It can't all be real," Ingrid insisted desperately, her certainty crumbling visibly. "Some must be fabricated, exaggerated by the Allies for propaganda purposes, to justify their invasion and make us accept defeat." But the photographs didn't exaggerate. You couldn't exaggerate mountains of corpses and industrial crematoria. You couldn't fake that many camps with that much consistent documentation. You couldn't create that scale of fabrication across multiple Allied armies and neutral observers. It was real, all of it. Katrin spoke with the careful precision of someone whose rationality was crumbling under impossible weight. "I was a teacher. I taught children to love Germany, to be proud of our culture and history and achievements, to believe in our superiority and destiny. What did I teach them to love? What poison did I put in their minds?" Frida stared at her hands, nurses' hands trained to heal. "I healed soldiers so they could return to duty, return to fight. Did they go to these camps after I healed them? Did I help them murder by making them healthy enough to kill?" Greta's analytical mind had found no framework large enough to contain this horror. My communications work connected the entire military network, transmitted orders across occupied territories. How many of those orders sent people to the camps? What did my efficiency enable? Young Liesel just cried with the rawness of 19 years old, confronting evil beyond her capacity to process. "My father worked in a factory making ball bearings. He thought he was supporting our defense. He died never knowing those bearings went into the machinery of death, never knowing his labor supported genocide." Annalisa sat apart from them all, the crackerjack compass in one hand that had shown her American truth, the photograph of her dead parents in the other hand that reminded her of everything lost. Two truths that couldn't coexist but had to anyway. Her parents had been good people, kind, decent, educated, cultured. They had raised her with values and morality and belief in civilization. But they had lived in a country that built factories of death. They had supported a government that perpetrated genocide. They had been complicit through silence and acceptance and failure to question. And so was she, whether she knew or not, whether she participated directly or not, whether she believed she served righteousness or not. The victims were equally dead either way. That was the truth the compass had pointed toward all along. She had served evil, not through malice, but through ignorance and propaganda and failure to question what she was told. But the result was the same: millions dead, and she was part of the system that killed them. How did you live with that? How did you carry that guilt? How did you become anything other than what you had been when what you had been was unforgivable? Father O'Brien held daily counseling sessions for any prisoner who wanted to speak with him for the next 2 weeks. The chapel became a refuge filled with grief and questions and desperate searching for meaning in the meaningless. Annalisa went every day, sometimes speaking, sometimes sitting in silence, sometimes screaming at God for allowing this, sometimes begging for forgiveness she didn't deserve. One afternoon, a week after the photographs, Father O'Brien said something that cut through her despair, like light through darkness. God can forgive anything if we truly repent, but you must first forgive yourself for not knowing what you couldn't have known given the propaganda and censorship. Then you must commit to being better than you were, to standing against such evil if you ever encounter it again, to ensuring it never happens again through your choices and actions. How? Annalisa asked desperately. How do I forgive myself when millions are dead because of what my country did? By living a life that honors them, by becoming someone who would have fought this if you had known, by making sure future generations know the truth so they can't be deceived the same way, by choosing every day to be better. While it wasn't absolution, it wasn't erasure of guilt, it wasn't permission to stop grieving or feeling shame, but it was a direction forward when all paths seemed to lead into darkness, a possibility that redemption might be possible even for the complicit, a path that required active choice rather than passive acceptance. Sergeant Blackwood found her in the office a week after the photographs. She had been sitting at her desk staring at filing that seemed meaningless when she knew what her country had done. He set a cup of tea beside her with his usual gentle care. Then he sat down across from her, not behind his desk in a position of authority, but across from her as an equal. I saw something similar when we liberated towns in France, he said quietly. Not camps on this scale, but villages where the SS had been, mass graves, civilians executed, children murdered for partisan connections, the things they did to people. Annalisa flinched as if struck. I wanted to hate all Germans after that, he continued with brutal honesty. Wanted to see you all as monsters, as enemies who deserved whatever we did to you, as people beyond redemption or mercy. He paused, looked at her directly with those patient eyes that saw everything. But then I worked with you, with Greta and Katrine and the others, and I saw that you're not monsters. You're people who believed lies told by monsters, who served evil without knowing its full scope or true nature, who are now carrying guilt that will never fully leave you, but doesn't have to define you forever. Tears streamed down her face in rivers. The question isn't whether you share some level of guilt, Blackwood said gently but firmly. You do. We all do when evil happens and we don't resist. Everyone who didn't question, everyone who looked away, everyone who believed the easy lies instead of asking hard questions, that guilt is real and appropriate. He leaned forward with intensity. But the question is, what will you do with that guilt? Will you let it crush you into nothing? Will you use it as an excuse to give up? Or will you let it transform you into someone who never looks away again, someone who questions authority, someone who stands against evil even when it's hard? Annalisa met his eyes through her tears. I don't know if I can be that person. You can, he said with absolute certainty that allowed no doubt. I've watched you for months now. You're stronger than you think. And you deserve the chance to prove it to yourself and the world. The words settled into her like seeds planted in scorched earth. She didn't believe them yet. couldn't believe them yet, but she wanted to. And maybe wanting to believe was the first small step toward transformation. Small steps, daily choices. Building something new from ruins, she picked up the supply requisition form she'd been staring at, started filing with mechanical movements. It was a small choice, insignificant in isolation, but it was a choice toward survival rather than surrender, toward transformation rather than despair, toward the terrifying possibility that redemption might be possible, even for the unforgivable, if you worked for it every day for the rest of your life. One small choice at a time. May 8th, 1945 arrived with unseasonable warmth and news that had been inevitable for weeks, but still carried the weight of finality. Germany had surrendered, unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Captain Eleanor Whitmore made the announcement during morning assembly. Her voice carried across the mess hall without triumph or celebration, just stating historical facts that would reshape the world. Professional to the end, Victory in Europe Day, VE Day. The newspapers and radio broadcasts were calling it the end of the 1,000-year Reich that had lasted only 12 years, the end of Nazi Germany, the end of Hitler's dream of continental domination. The German women sat in stunned silence as the announcement echoed through the mess hall. This should have been devastating news. Their country defeated utterly, occupied by foreign armies, divided among victorious powers who would reshape it according to their own visions. But after the photographs from the camps, after the revelation of what the Reich had truly been beneath the propaganda and promises, Anneliese Vogel felt something she hadn't expected. Relief. Pure, overwhelming relief that made her hands tremble. It was over. The war was over. The killing would stop. The machine that had built Auschwitz would build no more death camps. The system that had murdered millions had finally been stopped by force, since it would never have stopped itself. Her country had lost the war, but humanity had won something more important. The thought felt like treason against everything she'd been raised to believe. Like betrayal of her dead parents who had supported the Reich. Like abandoning her missing brothers who had fought for Germany. But the crackerjack compass on her footlocker pointed toward truth. And truth demanded honesty, even when honesty hurt. Germany deserved to lose this war, deserved to be defeated, deserved to face consequences for what it had done, and she was part of that Germany whether she liked it or not. Captain Whitmore continued speaking, pulling her from dark thoughts. Repatriation procedures will begin within 3 weeks. Transportation will be arranged to displaced persons camps in Europe. From there, you will be processed and released to rebuild your lives in post-war Germany under Allied occupation. The words should have brought joy, relief, hope for return to everything familiar. Instead, they brought dread that settled in her stomach like lead. Return to what? Destroyed cities where infrastructure had collapsed and starvation threatened? Dead families who couldn't welcome anyone home? A country that would spend generations living down the shame of what had been done in its name? Anneliese thought of Dresden. Rubble now. Entire neighborhoods erased by firestorms. Her parents buried somewhere in that rubble with thousands of others. Her apartment building a pile of broken stone and twisted metal. Her brothers missing, probably dead. Even if they had survived the war, would they want to see her? Would they blame her for surviving while they suffered? Would they be the same people she remembered, or would war have changed them beyond recognition? What exactly was she returning to? What life waited for her in the ruins? But Captain Whitmore wasn't finished. She paused with deliberate timing, looked across the assembled women with an expression that was hard to read. However, she said carefully, letting the word hang in the air, given the unusual circumstances and the ongoing chaos in occupied Germany, The War Department has authorized a limited exception to standard repatriation procedures. The room grew quieter, if that was even possible, every woman leaning forward slightly to hear better. Those who wish to remain in the United States temporarily may petition for reclassification as displaced persons rather than prisoners of war. The words hung in the air like something impossible, like a miracle that couldn't be real. Stay in America? Choose to remain with former enemies rather than return to homeland? The idea was radical, unprecedented, shocking. This status would allow you to seek sponsorship from American families or organizations willing to vouch for your character, to find employment that supports you, to navigate immigration procedures that are complex and uncertain. It is a risk with absolutely no guarantees of success, but it is being offered to those who believe they have no future in Germany or who wish to build new lives here. Annaliese's heart began to race so hard she thought others might hear it. This was a choice she hadn't known existed, a path forward she hadn't dared to imagine, a possibility that felt like salvation and betrayal simultaneously. That evening, Barrack 7 exploded into urgent German conversations that lasted late into the night. Some women immediately declared their intention to return to Germany without hesitation. Their families were there, alive or dead. Their lives were there, destroyed or not. Their identities were German, and nothing could change that. However ruined the homeland was, it was still home. Others wanted time to consider, to weigh impossible options with no good answers, to write down pros and cons, as if logic could solve a problem of the heart. But 9 women knew their answer almost immediately with a certainty that surprised them. Annalisa sat on her bunk, the crackerjack compass in her hand, turning it over and over, the Thomas Mann novel beside her, the banned book given by American church ladies, the photograph of her dead parents on her footlocker. Everything she had been was gone. Her family, her city, her beliefs, her country, her certainty about who she was and what mattered. She could return to Germany and spend the rest of her life trying to rebuild something from ruins, living in the ashes of what had been, carrying guilt and shame everywhere, being part of a defeated nation that would take generations to heal if it ever did. Or she could stay in America and try to become something new, someone who had learned from terrible mistakes, someone who would never serve evil again through ignorance, someone worthy of the unexpected kindness she had received when she deserved none. Greta Lindemann sat beside her with the same calculation in her analytical eyes. "I have no one to return to," she said quietly. "Berlin is rubble. My neighborhood doesn't exist. My family is dead. What future waits for me there?" Katrin Richter joined them, the former teacher, whose worldview had shattered as completely as anyone's. "What will I teach German children now? How to be proud of a country that built death camps, how to love a culture that embraced genocide, how to respect a government that murdered millions. I can't do it. I can't go back and pretend that didn't happen." Frieda Zimmermann, the nurse whose hands had healed German soldiers, spoke softly. "I could help people in Germany. They'll need nurses desperately. But I could also help people here with better supplies and better training, perhaps do more good with resources that actually exist." Young Liesel Hoffmann, 19 years old and utterly lost, whispered through tears, "I don't know where my mother and sister are. They could be anywhere in Germany or dead like father. I could spend years searching in chaos and never find them. And if I can't find them, I'd be alone in a destroyed country with nothing and no one. At least here." She trailed off, unable to finish. One by one they gathered. 9 women who had nothing to return to in Germany. 9 women who had found something unexpected in American captivity that went beyond physical safety. Not just abundance of food and resources, not just civil treatment and adherence to Geneva Convention, but the possibility of redemption through transformation, the possibility of becoming better than they had been, the possibility of building new lives not haunted by old guilt. Not everyone agreed with this choice. Ingrid Kraus remained adamant and defiant in her certainty, the hardliner who needed beliefs to cling to. "Our country needs us now more than ever," she argued, her voice hard with conviction. "Germany is destroyed. We have a duty to rebuild. We can't abandon our homeland in its darkest hour just because America is more comfortable. That would make us cowards and traitors to everything German." The words stung because they carried truth that couldn't be entirely dismissed. Germany did need rebuilding, did need hands to clear rubble and plant crops and teach children and nurse the wounded, hearts willing to face the shame and work towards something better. Souls brave enough to acknowledge what had been done and commit to never allowing it again. But Annalisa had faced the photographs of the camps with their mountains of shoes and bodies, had carried the weight of guilt for serving a genocidal regime even unknowingly, had felt her entire identity shatter like glass and reform into something new and uncertain. She couldn't go back to being German in the old way. Not yet, maybe not ever. That night she drafted a letter in careful English that had improved dramatically over 6 months. Greta helped with grammar and phrasing, Katrin suggested diplomatic language, Frida added touches of human appeal. The letter was addressed to Captain Whitmore and would be signed by 9 women whose fates were about to diverge from their comrades forever. Annalisa wrote in her careful European script, "Captain Whitmore, we respectfully request reclassification as displaced persons and permission to remain in the United States rather than return to Germany. We have nothing to return to in our homeland. Our families are dead or missing, our cities are destroyed beyond recognition. Our beliefs have been shattered by the revelation of our government's crimes against humanity. We discovered in American captivity values of human dignity, opportunity, and redemption that we wish to embrace fully and honestly. We wish to demonstrate through our actions and our lives that transformation is possible, that former enemies can become friends, that individuals can choose to be better than the systems that form them. We understand fully the difficulties we face. We accept the uncertainty of our futures. We know we may be rejected or fail, but we believe that choosing to stay and build new lives here is choosing hope over despair, future over past, possibility over certainty of failure. We humbly ask for the chance to prove ourselves worthy of this extraordinary opportunity that we know we do not deserve but desperately need. We thank you for your consideration." Respectfully submitted, Annalisa signed her name first. The pen trembled in her hand so badly the signature was barely legible. This was choosing exile, choosing to become someone without a country, someone between 2 worlds belonging fully to neither. But it was also choosing to live rather than merely survive, choosing to become rather than to remain, choosing transformation over stagnation. And after everything that had happened, that felt like the only choice worth making. Liesl Hoffmann signed second, her young hand shaking. Marguerite Lindemann signed third with analytical precision. Katrin Richter signed fourth in a teacher's careful script. Frida Zimmermann signed fifth with a nurse's steady hand. 4 others signed after them, each adding their names to a document that would change their lives forever. 9 signatures, 9 women choosing exile over return, 9 paths diverging from the other 34, 9 gambles on redemption. The letter created immediate controversy that spread beyond Camp Ellis. Within days, the story leaked to local newspapers hungry for human interest during the transition from war to peace. German prisoners requesting to stay with their captors rather than accept freedom to return home. Enemy personnel choosing American life over German homeland. Nazi auxiliaries seeking American redemption. The story spread quickly through Illinois and beyond, generating reactions that ranged from supportive to hostile across the spectrum of American opinion. Some Americans were deeply supportive, saw it as evidence of American values triumphing over Nazi ideology. proof that democracy and kindness could win hearts that force could only conquer. Others were intensely hostile, questioned whether enemy personnel should receive special consideration while American soldiers still fought in the Pacific, asked why Germans got opportunities when Americans suffered, demanded they be sent home to face the consequences of their country's actions. The Peoria Journal ran an editorial titled "Enemy Prisoners Seek American Dream" that was generally sympathetic. The Chicago Tribune published a more skeptical piece questioning whether former Nazi personnel deserved compassion or should face collective punishment. Local radio stations hosted debates with callers expressing passionate opinions on both sides. Religious organizations were among the first to step forward with concrete support. Father O'Brien contacted the Catholic Diocese of Peoria and began organizing potential sponsors among parish families. The Riverside Lutheran Church in Davenport, the same congregation that had sent Christmas packages, offered to sponsor two of the women sight unseen, Faith in Action. And in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, a family named Henderson contacted Captain Whitmore directly. Mrs. Eleanor Henderson, school teacher, the same woman who had sent the Thomas Mann novel to Annalise in the Christmas package. She offered to sponsor personally the girl who had received her book, based solely on faith that redemption was possible for anyone willing to work for it, based on Christian belief that mercy mattered more than revenge, based on American ideals that anyone could become American if they embraced the values, sight unseen, personal risk accepted, future uncertain, but offered anyway because some things mattered more than safety or certainty. The debate in Barrack 7 grew more intense as June approached and the departure date solidified. Ingrid Krause confronted Annalisa one final time in what became a defining conversation. The two women stood facing each other in the narrow space between bunks, representing two different paths forward from the same terrible past. "You're abandoning our country when it needs us most," Ingrid said, her voice bitter, but also hurt, also afraid. "History will remember you as traitors who chose comfort over duty, cowards who ran from responsibility." Annalisa met her eyes steadily without flinching. 6 months ago she would have agreed, would have seen staying as betrayal, but she had changed in ways that couldn't be undone. "Perhaps history will remember us that way," she said, quietly but firmly. "Or perhaps history will remember us as those who chose to build bridges instead of walls. You'll rebuild Germany with your hands and your courage. I'll try to rebuild Germany's reputation with my life and my choices. Both paths serve our country, just differently." Ingrid's expression wavered. The anger wasn't just anger, Annalisa realized. It was fear. Fear of facing the ruins alone. Fear that choosing to stay was actually the braver choice. Fear that Annalisa was right and going back was the coward's path. "How can you face Americans every day?" Ingrid asked, her voice breaking slightly. "Knowing what we did, what our country did in our names. How can you accept their kindness when we don't deserve it?" "How can I face Germans?" Annalisa replied gently. "Knowing the same things? The guilt follows me either way. The shame is permanent regardless of geography. But here I can try to become someone different, someone better, someone who would have resisted if I had known." The logic was inescapable and devastating. Guilt didn't have a geographic solution. Shame didn't respect borders. The work of redemption could happen anywhere or nowhere, depending entirely on the choices made daily. Ingrid's shoulders sagged as the fight drained from her, her certainty finally crumbling under the weight of too many contradictions. "Maybe you're right," she said finally, the admission costing her visible effort. "Maybe both paths are necessary for Germany's future. You can be ambassadors here. Show them that not all Germans embraced evil, that some of us were deceived but can learn. We'll create a country worthy of the name again in the ruins, or die trying." She stepped forward suddenly, embraced Annalisa with desperate strength, Two former comrades about to walk different paths forever.
Be well, Annalisa, Ingrid whispered. Make them see us as human. Make them understand we're not all monsters. Some of us just believed the wrong things. Be well, Ingrid, Annalisa replied, returning the embrace. Make Germany human again. Make it a place where what happened can never happen again. Teach the children truth instead of propaganda. The reconciliation felt like grace, like proof that even the hardest divisions could be bridged if people chose understanding over hatred.
Like evidence that redemption was possible even for those who had served evil. June 15th, 1945 dawned with heavy rain that seemed to mourn the coming separation. The morning started with activity that tried to mask emotion with efficiency. 34 women prepared to board trucks to the train station, then to ships, then to displaced persons camps in occupied Germany, then to whatever futures awaited them in the ruins of the Reich. 9 women prepared to stay behind and face uncertain American futures. The mess hall became a gathering point for final goodbyes, a last meal together, a final moment of unity before permanent division. Annalisa watched Ingrid and the others with memorizing intensity, recording faces and voices and small details, the way Greta laughed at something, the way Katrin gestured when making a point, the way Liesel wiped her eyes, the way Frida touched people's arms when offering comfort. These women had shared 6 months of transformation, from enemies to prisoners to something more complicated and profound, sisters in grief and guilt and terrible knowledge. The trucks arrived at 1000 hours with military punctuality. The women who were leaving gathered their few belongings in small bags, exchanged addresses that might never reach their destinations through the chaos of occupied Germany, made promises to write that might never be kept if they couldn't be delivered. Ingrid embraced each of the 9 staying women individually. When she reached Annalisa, she held her longest. "Don't forget who you are," she whispered fiercely. "You're German, even if you live in America. That can't be erased." "I'm trying to become who I should have been," Annalisa replied quietly. "Someone who questions, someone who resists evil, someone worthy of the second chance I'm being given." "Then be that person," Ingrid said, "for all of us." The trucks pulled away slowly through the rain, faces visible in windows, hands waving, growing smaller, disappearing around the bend, gone. The 9 who remained stood in the rain watching until there was nothing left to see, feeling the weight of their choice settle onto their shoulders like a physical burden. They were no longer prisoners of war. They were displaced persons. People without a country, people without a clear future, people who had chosen hope despite having every reason for despair. Captain Whitmore approached with characteristic directness, handed each of them official paperwork in folders. "Your sponsors will arrive this afternoon to collect you. You'll be released into their custody. From this moment forward, you are their responsibility, legally and practically, and they are choosing to take that responsibility willingly despite the risks and social consequences." She paused, looked at each of them with an expression that mixed respect and warning. "Make them proud," she said quietly but firmly. "Prove that mercy is stronger than hatred. Prove that people can change fundamentally. Prove that we were right to offer you this chance when others said we were wrong. The eyes of America will be watching. Don't waste this opportunity." The weight of that expectation was enormous and terrifying, but Annalisa had carried the weight of guilt for months, had carried grief and shame and the knowledge of what her country had done. This was different weight. This was the weight of possibility instead of only burden, the weight of future instead of only past, the weight of hope instead of only despair. And somehow, impossibly, that weight felt lighter. Sergeant Theodore Blackwood appeared at 1400 hours in civilian clothes, not the uniform Annalise had seen him wear every day for 6 months. Regular civilian clothes that made him look softer somehow,
more approachable, more human. A woman walked beside him, blonde hair graying at the temples, kind face with laugh lines around the eyes. His wife, Sarah Blackwood. They approached Annalisa together while she stood uncertainly with her small bag of belongings. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might be visible through her shirt. Blackwood smiled, that patient smile she had come to know so well. "Miss Vogel," he said formally, using her name with respect. "This is my wife, Sarah. We'd like to offer you sponsorship if you'll accept it, if you'll trust us." Annalisa stared, unable to process the words into meaning. Sarah Blackwood stepped forward with maternal warmth that radiated like heat. "We have a room prepared in our home in Cedar Rapids. Our daughters are excited to meet you and help you adjust. We've arranged a job interview at the public library for next week. They need someone who reads German to catalogue some donated collections. And we've enrolled you in English classes at the community centre to improve your language skills." She took Annalisa's hands in her own with gentle firmness. "We know this is frightening. We know you've lost everything and are facing an uncertain future. But you don't have to face it alone. We want to help, if you'll let us, if you'll trust us." Annalisa felt tears streaming down her face in rivers. "Why?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm your enemy. My country killed your nephew, murdered millions, destroyed half of Europe. Why would you do this for someone like me?" Blackwood's expression grew serious and thoughtful. He took a moment before answering, choosing words carefully. "Because my nephew, Thomas, died fighting tyranny and evil. Fighting for the idea that people deserve dignity and freedom and second chances. That everyone has value regardless of where they're born. If I let hatred win after his sacrifice, if I refuse mercy to those who need it, then what did he die for? What did his life mean?" He paused, meeting her eyes with unwavering directness. "You were my enemy." Past tense. "But I've worked with you for 6 months. I've seen your transformation from believer to questioner. I've watched you wrestle with guilt that would crush most people into nothing. I've seen you choose to keep going every day, even when giving up would be easier. That takes real strength." His voice grew gentler, but no less firm. "War made you an enemy, but peace makes you something else. Something better if you choose to be, and I see my daughters in you, young women trying to navigate an impossible world, making mistakes, learning, growing, deserving the chance to become who they're meant to be." Sarah Blackwood spoke softly, adding her voice. "We have room in our home for you, room in our hearts if you'll accept it, and if you'll trust us despite everything, room in our family, not as a servant or dependent, but as a daughter who needs parents after losing hers." The kindness was overwhelming, crushing in its generosity. This man who had lost his nephew to German bullets at Normandy, this woman who had knitted scarves for enemy prisoners at Christmas, offering not just sponsorship but family, not just opportunity but belonging, not just tolerance but love. Annalisa couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. She nodded frantically, tried to find words in English or German or any language. "Yes," she finally managed. "Shh. Yes, I accept. Thank you. Thank you. I don't deserve this, but I accept. And I'll work every day to be worthy of it." And then she did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She stepped forward and embraced Theodore Blackwood. Not as a prisoner embracing a guard with proper distance, but as a daughter embracing a father with desperate need. "Papa Blackwood," she whispered against his shoulder, the name coming naturally, feeling right in a way that transcended logic. "Thank you for seeing me as human when I didn't deserve it." He held her gently, patting her back the way fathers do. "Welcome home, Anna," he said, using the American version of her name for the first time, making it official. "Welcome home, daughter. Your new life starts now."
The lecture hall at the University of Iowa was packed beyond capacity. Students filled every seat. Faculty lined the walls. Local community members stood in the back, all gathered to hear a guest speaker on post-war reconciliation and the immigrant experience. At the podium stood Annalisa Vogel Whitmore, 48 years old now, with hair graying gracefully at the temples, lines around her eyes that spoke of both sorrow lived through and laughter earned, wearing a simple blue dress that matched her eyes. She had married an American veteran in 1952. Thomas Whitmore, a kind man who had fought in the Pacific Theater and returned home believing deeply in second chances and redemption through choice. They had 2 children together, Michael, 15, a serious boy who wanted to be a history teacher, Sarah, 13, named for Sarah Blackwood, a girl who loved books and languages and asked difficult questions, American kids who grew up knowing their mother's story but never knowing war, growing up with the luxury of peace their parents' generation had fought to secure. On the podium beside her, notes, sat a tiny red compass. The Crackerjack compass. 24 years old now, paint chipped further, but still functional, still pointing north with perfect accuracy. She began her lecture the way she always did when speaking about her experiences, by holding up the compass for everyone to see. This compass was given to me in a box of candy by an American sergeant who was simply sharing his afternoon snack during a work break. He had no idea that this simple gesture would shatter my entire worldview and change the course of my life forever. The audience leaned forward with collective focus. I came to America as a prisoner of war in November 1944. I was 24 years old, the same age as many of you students. I had been raised to believe specific things about Americans that turned out to be propaganda designed to make me fear and hate you. She paused deliberately, let the words land. I believed Americans were barbaric and cruel, that you were greedy and weak, that your democracy was a lie-hiding tyranny, that your abundance was propaganda while you secretly starved, that your industrial power was fiction while your economy collapsed. Someone in the audience shifted, papers rustled, everyone utterly focused. On December 5th, 1944, Sergeant Theodore Blackwood, who became my American father, gave me a box of Crackerjack without ceremony or agenda. Inside, among the candied popcorn, I found this compass. A toy, a manufactured metal toy given away free with candy during wartime when metal was supposedly precious. She turned the compass over in her fingers, the familiar gesture comforting. In Germany, we were rationing every gram of metal for bullets and weapons, yet America was putting compasses in candy boxes for children. That contradiction created a crack in my certainty about everything I had been taught, and through that crack, truth began to seep in like light into darkness. The lecture continued for an hour, carefully prepared testimony about transformation and redemption, about arriving at Camp Ellis expecting cruelty and finding patient kindness, about abundant meals that contradicted years of propaganda about American poverty, about Christmas packages from Iowa church ladies who prayed for her safe return to a country actively fighting theirs, about letters from home announcing her parents' deaths in Allied bombing raids, about photographs from liberated concentration camps that destroyed everything she thought she knew about her homeland, about the impossible choice between returning to ruins or staying to rebuild herself, about the Blackwood family offering not just sponsorship, but genuine family. Papa Blackwood taught me something crucial that I want you all to understand, she said near the end, her voice thick with emotion that 24 years hadn't diminished. He taught me that enemies are just people who don't know each other yet, that hatred is a choice we make, that compassion is also a choice, and that only one of those choices builds futures worth living in. She held up the compass again with reverence. This pointed me toward truth when I was lost in lies. America gave me the freedom to follow that direction, to discover who I could become rather than being trapped forever by who I had been at 24, to transform from enemy to citizen through daily choices over many years. Her voice strengthened with conviction earned through living. That is the true power of this country that I've come to love as deeply as the Germany I was born in. Not military might, though you have that, not economic strength, though you have that too, but the capacity to offer second chances to those willing to earn them, to see humanity even in enemies, to choose mercy over vengeance when revenge would be easier and feel more satisfying. The audience erupted in sustained applause that lasted several minutes, but Annaliese's attention was drawn immediately to the back of the lecture hall. An older man stood there leaning slightly on a cane, 65 years old, grey hair. Those same patient eyes she remembered from 24 years ago. Theodore Blackwood. Retired now after a full career. Living quietly with Sarah in the same Cedar Rapids house where Annalise had first learned to be American. He had driven 2 hours to hear her speak despite his arthritis and Sarah's concerns about his health. Tears streamed down his weathered face unchecked. After the lecture ended and the crowd began to disperse, Annalise made her way through clusters of students asking questions, reached him finally. "Papa Blackwood," she said with all the warmth of 2 decades of chosen family. He opened his arms without words. She stepped into them like coming home. The same embrace as 24 years earlier in the rain. Father and chosen daughter, family built through choice rather than blood. "You did good, Anna," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "You did real good, made us proud every single day. I'm only here because you chose compassion when hatred would have been easier," she replied, her own voice breaking. "You saved my soul when I deserved nothing, gave me everything when I had nothing to offer in return. You saved yourself," he corrected gently but firmly. "I just held the door open. You walked through it. You did the hard work of transformation. You chose to become better every single day." They stood together in the emptying lecture hall. 2 people connected by war but defined by peace, by the choice to see humanity across enemy lines, by the courage to offer and accept second chances, by the belief that transformation was possible even for the broken and guilty. Sarah Blackwood joined them with careful steps, her own hair white now, but her smile unchanged. Embraced Annalise with maternal warmth that had never wavered in 24 years. "Come for Sunday dinner," she said firmly. "Bring Tom and the children. It's been 3 weeks, too long between visits. The house feels empty without you." Family. Chosen family built from the ashes of war, stronger than blood because it was forged in conscious choice rather than accident of birth, built on forgiveness and second chances and daily decisions to choose love over easier hatred. Theodore Blackwood Jr. sat in a hospice room in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, holding a wooden box that contained his father's secrets. He was 75 years old now. His father Theodore had passed in 2015 at 92. His mother Sarah had followed a year later at 90, unable to live without her partner of 70 years. In the hospice room's single bed lay a woman of 98, Annalise Fogel Whitmore, dying slowly but peacefully. Surrounded by photographs of the life she had built with borrowed time. Her husband Tom had passed 5 years earlier, but her children visited daily. Michael, a history professor now, Sarah, a social worker specializing in refugee resettlement. Her grandchildren brought flowers and stories and evidence that her life had mattered beyond her own existence. She had lived a full life, a good life built on the foundation of undeserved grace, a life that honored the second chance she'd been given in 1945. Theodore Jr. had brought the Foot Locker contents finally. The 23 letters his father had saved for 70 years. The compass that had started everything. Annalisa's eyes were cloudy with age now, but they focused when she saw the tiny red compass with recognition that transcended time.
I wondered what happened to that, she whispered, her voice weak but clear. Your father kept it all these years? He kept everything, Theodore said gently. Every letter you ever wrote him, every Christmas card, every photograph. Along with this compass, I found them all after he passed. Read every letter. That's when I knew I had to find you, to thank you for what you gave him. Thank me? Her confusion was genuine and somehow touching. For what? He gave me everything.
For showing my father that his service meant something beyond killing and winning. That kindness could triumph where violence only conquered. That mercy was strength rather than weakness. That choosing to see humanity in enemies was the bravest choice possible. He opened one of the letters carefully, the paper fragile with age. Read aloud in a voice that trembled. Dear Papa Blackwood, today Michael asked me about the war in Germany and how I came to America. I showed him the compass. Told him about the sergeant who shared candy and changed my life forever. He asked if you're a hero like the soldiers who fought. I said yes, the truest kind, the kind who wins hearts instead of battles, the kind whose victory lasts generations. Theodore's voice broke completely. My father never talked about the war much, never claimed to be anything special or heroic, just said he did his duty like millions of others. But these letters, they show who he really was beneath the modesty. They show what he gave you and what you gave him in return. Annalisa reached out with trembling hands that had grown fragile with age. Theodore placed the compass in her palm with infinite care. She held it like something sacred, stared at it with eyes that saw not just the present, but 73 years of choices that had flowed from this tiny toy. This belongs to your family now, she said firmly, despite her weakness. Your father's legacy. Give it to your children.
Your grandchildren. Tell them the story. Make sure they understand what it means. What does it mean? Theodore asked, wanting to hear it from her one more time. It means that a tiny compass and a kind man prove that enemies can become family, that hatred is not destiny, that people can choose who they become regardless of who they've been, that walls can become bridges if we're brave enough to build them, that the future is made through small daily choices, not grand dramatic gestures.
She pressed the compass back into his hands with fading strength. Tell them to point themselves toward kindness, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Tell them that's what your father taught me. That's what saved my life. That's what made everything possible. Her eyes drifted closed, exhaustion claiming her. Tell them their great-grandfather was the best man I ever knew besides my husband. Tell them he gave a German enemy a home and a future and a family. Tell them that's what America is supposed to mean. 3 days later, as dawn broke over Cedar Rapids with golden light, Annalisa Vogel Whitmore took her last breath. Her children held her hands on either side of the bed. Her grandchildren whispered prayers she had taught them. Her great-grandchildren were too young to understand, but felt the weight of the moment anyway. In her final moments, she smiled. A genuine smile of peace and completion. The compass rested on the nightstand beside her where Theodore had left it, pointing north one final time with the same accuracy it had possessed for 74 years. She had walked that direction since December 5th, 1944. From prisoner to daughter. From enemy to citizen. From broken to whole. From guilty to redeemed through daily choices over 7 decades. From lost to found. The journey was complete, the transformation finished. The life well lived, despite its terrible beginning. She had pointed herself toward kindness when hatred was expected, had built bridges when walls would have been easier, had chosen transformation over stagnation every single day for 74 years, and in doing so had proved that redemption was possible for anyone willing to work for it. That grace could triumph over guilt, that love could overcome hatred, that small daily choices compound into lives of meaning. Her funeral was attended by hundreds who filled the church and spilled into the parking lot. German immigrants and their American-born descendants, veterans and their families spanning multiple generations, teachers whose lives she had touched through her work at the library and community center, librarians she had mentored over 4 decades of service, students who had heard her speak about redemption and second chances and had carried those lessons forward, refugees she had helped settle in America, passing forward the grace she had received, her own sprawling family, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, representing the future she had built from ruins. Theodore Jr. gave the eulogy with the compass held high for everyone to see. This compass pointed my father toward compassion when hatred would have been justified and easier. It pointed Anna toward hope when despair would have been understandable. And now it points us toward the future. He looked at his teenage grandson, Ryan, sitting in the front row with solemn attention. Yesterday, I gave this compass to Ryan to keep safe. He asked me why a toy matters so much. Why we care about something so small and old. I told him it's not about the toy itself, it's about what it represents. He paused, letting silence amplify his words. This represents the moment propaganda met reality and reality won, the moment an enemy became a daughter, the moment mercy proved stronger than revenge, the moment small kindness created transformation that lasted 74 years and touched thousands of lives. Another pause, letting the weight settle. My father fought against tyranny in World War II, but he won his greatest victory not with weapons but with Cracker Jack. By seeing humanity in an enemy, by offering family to the displaced, by proving that America's true strength isn't military might, but moral courage to do the hard, right thing. After the funeral, Theodore Jr. drove to his grandson's middle school with the compass in his pocket. Ryan's history class was studying World War II, Holocaust, D-Day, atomic bombs, victory and occupation. Theodore brought the compass as a teaching tool more valuable than any textbook. Told the story from beginning to end. The students listened with the intense attention that truth commands when told by those who lived it. When he finished, a girl in the back row raised her hand with obvious urgency. "Mr. Blackwood, should we be kind to our enemies even when they've done terrible things?" Theodore Jr. held up the compass. Let the question hang in the air with proper weight. Then he smiled with the wisdom of a man who'd spent his life watching redemption unfold. Let me tell you about a German prisoner and an American sergeant, about a box of candy that changed the world, about choosing compassion when hatred was expected and easier, about building bridges when walls would require less courage, about transformation being possible if we're brave enough to believe in it and work for it every single day. He began the story again, the way it had been told to him by his father and by Anna herself, the way it would be told to future generations who needed to understand. The story of how truth defeats propaganda, how enemies become family, how small kindnesses compound into lives of meaning, how daily choices determine who we become, how redemption is possible for anyone willing to work for it, how a tiny compass from a Cracker Jack box became the symbol of transformation, how grace triumphs over guilt, how love overcomes hatred, how hope defeats despair. One small choice at a time, the compass needle swung in its housing as he held it, settled with mechanical precision, pointed north, always north, true north, toward kindness, toward compassion, toward forgiveness, toward second chances, toward redemption, toward hope, toward home.